Hi, today we'll continue our story, and the situation I'm about to tell you will turn everything upside down. Everything seemed quiet and peaceful, but that night, when Jane met with Ray to discuss saving her children, something happened that completely changed her life. You won't believe it, but in reality, she found herself in the center of an incredible, shocking situation that made her heart race, and everything she thought about solving the problem came crashing down. But before you get comfortable, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's really interesting to see who's joined us. Now get comfortable, we're starting. Jane had always been a woman who gave more to others than she ever took for herself. At 45 years old, she had already experienced the grief of losing her husband, and with it, the emptiness that swallowed her life. Instead of retreating into sorrow, she sought a new purpose. After her husband's death, Jane decided she couldn't sit idle and chose to foster 3 children. Orphans who had no place to go. They came from troubled backgrounds, abandoned by their families. They were broken, angry, and silent, almost too far gone for anyone to bother with. Her decision wasn't made lightly. Jane knew that taking them in meant facing a battle of their own making. The kids were all teenagers. Kevin, the eldest at 20, was distant, rebellious, and filled with a brooding anger that no one could explain. Mary, 17, was quiet and withdrawn, struggling to trust anyone. And Jacob, the youngest at 16, was constantly locked in his own world, avoiding interaction and shying away from any form of affection. The first months were difficult. Jane did everything she could think of to connect with them, offering guidance, patience, and love. But the walls they had built around themselves were high. Kevin would disappear for days at a time, leaving Jane wondering if she had made a mistake. Mary seemed to have no interest in speaking to her, always avoiding eye contact and retreating to her room. Jacob was the most complicated of them all. He seemed to live in a different reality, one where nothing mattered and everything felt overwhelming. Despite the challenges, Jane was determined. She believed in the power of love, convinced that one day they would see that she cared for them. Slowly but surely, the years began to heal some of their wounds. Kevin returned home more often, although still distant. Mary started to open up a little, smiling faintly, though not often. But Jacob remained a mystery. He was still silent, still distant, and yet there was something in the way he looked at her sometimes, a look that unsettled her. Life seemed to be settling into a rhythm. Jane opened a small home goods shop on the corner of the street, a modest but steady business. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and it gave her a sense of purpose. The shop became a hub of sorts for the family. Her children occasionally helped out, but there was an underlying unease that Jane couldn't shake. It felt like the calm before a storm. Kevin began to change. He was still distant, but something darker seemed to have taken hold of him. He spent more and more time away from home, his behavior becoming more erratic. Mary, too, began acting strangely again, more withdrawn, nervous even. Jacob was the most concerning. Though he remained quiet, there was something in his eyes, a guarded, distant look, that made Jane uneasy. It wasn't until one fateful evening that everything came to a head. Jane arrived home late from the shop, only to find the door to her store slightly ajar. Her heart skipped a beat. She entered cautiously, but as soon as she stepped inside, she knew something was terribly wrong. The place had been ransacked. Shelves were overturned, the cash register was emptied, and her stock had been stripped. It wasn't just a break-in. It was a calculated, deliberate act. The dread that washed over her was like a tidal wave. She immediately contacted the police, but deep down, she knew this wasn't some random robbery. It wasn't an outsider. The thief had to be someone who knew her schedule, her routine, and her business inside and out. That night, as Jane sat in the living room, staring at the wreckage of her store, she realized the painful truth. One of her children was responsible for this. In the weeks that followed the robbery, Jane couldn't shake the feeling of unease that gripped her. The police had come, taken their statements, and dusted for fingerprints, but they had found nothing. The investigation seemed to stall, with no leads or clues pointing toward the culprit. Jane couldn't understand how this could have happened. Her business, her livelihood, had been destroyed, and the only thing she could think of was that one of her own children had been involved. Her heart told her it was Kevin. There was something about his recent behavior that had set her off. His late-night disappearances, his constant avoidance, and the shady people he seemed to be hanging out with. It all pointed to him. He was the one who had changed the most over the years. Whereas Mary and Jacob were at least still around, still somewhat engaged with the family, Kevin had become a stranger, a person she didn't recognize. Yet she couldn't prove anything. Kevin was good at keeping his distance, good at masking his emotions, Every time she tried to talk to him, he became defensive, even aggressive. He always found a way to deflect her questions, shrugging her off or becoming irritable. Jane tried to speak to him again one evening. She found him sitting in his room, staring out of the window, lost in thought. When he saw her standing in the doorway, he didn't say a word but simply turned his head, a look of irritation flickering across his face. "Kevin," Jane said, her voice trembling with the weight of the situation. "What happened to the store? You know I can't fix this without your help. Did you have anything to do with it?" Kevin slowly stood up, his body language stiff and defensive. He didn't look at her, but his clenched jaw and the tension in his posture spoke volumes. "Don't go there, Jane," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. "I told you, I didn't have anything to do with it." "Then why do I feel like you're hiding something from me? I know it wasn't just a random break-in, Kevin. Someone knew exactly what they were doing." "I said drop it!" Kevin snapped, his eyes flashing with anger. "I've had enough of this. I'm not some child you can control anymore. Just let me live my life." Jane's heart sank. She had always known that her son had been struggling, but now it seemed like there was a darkness inside him that she couldn't reach. She tried to step forward, to hold on to the last thread of connection they had, but Kevin turned away and slammed the door in her face. The conversation was over. The gap between them had widened, and Jane could feel it growing with every passing day. She couldn't understand what had happened to her son. The boy she had tried so hard to protect, to give a future to, was slipping away from her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. It wasn't just Kevin who made Jane feel uneasy. Mary, too, had begun to act strangely. Jane had noticed her avoiding her gaze more often, becoming more withdrawn. Mary used to be the one who would help around the house, who would smile occasionally, who seemed to want to belong. But now she was like a shadow, barely speaking, never making eye contact. Jane wondered if she knew something she wasn't telling her. One evening, when Jane was cleaning up in the kitchen, she found Mary sitting at the dining table, staring down at her hands. Her face was pale, her eyes unfocused. Jane couldn't bear the silence any longer. "Mary, what's going on? You've been so quiet lately. Is there something you're not telling me? I'm worried about you." Mary looked up slowly, her eyes distant. For a moment, Jane thought she might actually speak, but then Mary simply shook her head. "I'm fine," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. But Jane wasn't convinced. She could see the fear in her eyes, the hesitation. It was as if Mary was afraid of something, of someone. Jane didn't press further, but a growing suspicion gnawed at her. Could Mary be involved in the robbery too? Or was she simply caught up in Kevin's world, a world that Jane didn't understand? And then there was Jacob. Jane couldn't help but feel that something was very wrong with him. He had always been the quiet one, the one who hid behind his books, who preferred solitude. But lately, it was more than just his usual introverted behavior. Jacob was withdrawn to the point of being unrecognizable. He spent long hours locked in his room, and when Jane tried to talk to him, he barely acknowledged her. She had caught him sneaking around the house at odd hours, his movements furtive, as if he were hiding something. She had tried to confront him, just like she had with Kevin, but Jacob's response was always the same. Silence. He would simply look at her with those empty eyes, his face unreadable. It was as if he had checked out of their world entirely, and no amount of questioning would bring him back. Jane felt a growing sense of dread every time she looked at Jacob. She had no proof, no tangible evidence, but the way he acted, the way he was slowly slipping away from her, was enough to make her believe that he, too, had something to hide. Then, one afternoon, Jane made a discovery that confirmed her worst fears. She was going through the attic, sorting through old boxes and papers, when she found a small, hidden compartment in the floor. Inside was a thick bundle of cash, more money than Jane could ever have imagined. It was the same type of money that had been stolen from her shop. Her heart pounded in her chest as she picked up the money, feeling its cold, slick texture. She knew this wasn't from the store. This wasn't her money. She had never seen it before. Trembling, Jane held the bundle tightly in her hands. She didn't want to believe it, but she knew, deep down, that the truth was staring her in the face. One of her children was involved in something dangerous. The question now was, who? And why? As the days passed, Jane could feel the weight of the secret she was carrying grow heavier with each breath. The money hidden in the attic haunted her thoughts, constantly pulling her back to the terrifying possibility that one of her children was involved in something much worse than she had imagined. It wasn't just the robbery anymore. It was the suspicion that they were all tangled in something dark, something she couldn't yet understand. Jane knew she had to confront them, but how? Her heart ached with the thought of betraying their trust, of destroying the fragile bonds they had built over the years. The children she had loved, the children she had fought for, were now hiding something from her, and it felt as though she were losing them, piece by piece. The next evening, after a long day at the shop, Jane decided to gather the family together. The house was quiet, as it had been for weeks now, but tonight was different. Tonight, she had to know the truth. Kevin was sitting in his usual spot at the kitchen table, his eyes glued to his phone, as if trying to avoid any kind of conversation. Mary was in her room, her door slightly ajar, but Jane could see her staring at something in the corner, her expression unreadable. Jacob, as always, was nowhere to be found. Jane had a sinking feeling that he was somewhere in the house, lurking, hiding from her questions. She cleared her throat, trying to steady her nerves. "We need to talk," she said, her voice more firm than she felt. "All of us." Kevin didn't look up from his phone, but he muttered something under his breath, something that sounded like a sarcastic dismissal. Mary didn't move from her spot, and Jacob, as expected, was nowhere to be seen. "I'm serious," Jane pressed. "This isn't just about the store anymore. I know something's going on, and I can't keep pretending that everything's okay. We're a family, and families talk to each other." Finally, Kevin looked up. His face was stone cold, his eyes hard and defensive. "You don't get it, do you, Jane?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "There's nothing to talk about. You're just overreacting." "Overreacting?" Jane's voice trembled, but she didn't let it break. "You're acting like you don't care. You've been gone all the time, hiding things from me, and I'm supposed to pretend like everything's fine?" Kevin stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You don't understand anything. You don't know what's really going on in my life. You've never understood, and you never will." His eyes flicked toward the door, like he was about to leave. Jane's heart sank as he turned toward the door. "Kevin, wait," she said, but he was already out of the room, disappearing down the hallway. She could hear the slam of his bedroom door seconds later. A cold silence fell over the house. Jane felt as though the walls were closing in on her, but she knew she couldn't let it end like this. Not again. She walked to Mary's room, her steps heavy, but determined. Mary was still sitting on her bed, her gaze fixed on the floor. When Jane entered the room, Mary didn't look up. "Mary," Jane said gently, her voice softening. "Please talk to me. I can see something's wrong. Please don't shut me out. If you know anything about the robbery, I need to know." At first, there was no response. Then, just as Jane was about to leave, Mary spoke in a barely audible whisper. "I don't know anything," she said, her voice shaky. "I swear I don't know what happened to the store. I didn't take anything." Jane took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "It's not just about the robbery, Mary. I'm worried about you. All of you. You've been so distant lately. Please, if something's going on, you can tell me. I won't judge you. I just want to help." Mary finally looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, the door slammed open, and Jacob appeared in the doorway, his face pale and his expression guarded. "What's going on?" Jacob asked, his voice shaky. "Why are you all acting like this?" Jane froze, her heart racing. She hadn't expected Jacob to be standing there, and yet, somehow, it made sense. He had been avoiding her, but now he was here, as though he knew the time had come for him to face the truth. "Jacob," Jane said softly, her eyes locked with his. "I need to know if you know anything about the robbery. I need to understand what's happening. I'm not going to let this go." Jacob's face twisted into an expression of discomfort, and for a moment, Jane saw something in his eyes that made her stomach twist. Fear. Fear, not just of her, but of something else, something deeper, something he was trying desperately to hide. I didn't do it," Jacob muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. His hands fidgeted nervously at his sides, his eyes darting toward the floor. "I swear, I didn't have anything to do with it." Jane took a step closer. "Then what is going on, Jacob? What are you hiding? I know there's something you're not telling me." For the first time, Jacob met her gaze. His eyes were filled with shame, guilt, and something darker. Jane's heart clenched. She could see it now. Jacob wasn't just hiding something. He was part of something much larger, something that had taken root in him long before the robbery. I can't," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to get involved.
Get involved in what? Jane's voice trembled with a mixture of fear and disbelief.
Jacob took a deep breath, then whispered, I've been working with people. Bad people. They told me not to say anything, but I couldn't just keep lying to you anymore. Jane's world seemed to crash down around her. She had known something was wrong, but she hadn't been prepared for this. Her own son, her baby boy, was involved in something criminal, something dangerous. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut.
Who are they, Jacob?
She asked, her voice shaking. Who are these people? Jacob shook his head, panic rising in his chest. I can't say. I'm sorry, Jane. I didn't mean for this to happen, but I didn't have a choice. I had to do it. They threatened me. Jane reached out, taking his trembling hands in hers. We'll figure this out, Jacob. You don't have to do this alone. You've made a mistake, but we can fix it together. I'll help you. But deep inside, Jane wasn't sure if it was too late for them. The darkness was already spreading, and she wasn't sure they could escape it. The air in Jane's house felt heavy, as the weight of Jacob's confession hung over them all. His trembling hands still clutched hers, but Jane could feel his fear as though it were a living, breathing thing. She had always known that something was wrong. Kevin's erratic behavior, Mary's withdrawal, and Jacob's strange silences. But she had never imagined it would be like this. Her own son, caught up in a world of crime, threats, and lies. Jane stepped back, her mind racing. She knew she had to keep it together, for Jacob's sake, but inside she was shaking. This wasn't what she had envisioned when she had decided to adopt these children. She hadn't thought she'd be facing a situation like this, one that would tear apart everything she had worked so hard to build. Who are they, Jacob? She asked again, her voice calm but filled with desperation. Who are these people? What have you gotten involved with? Jacob's face contorted with guilt, and he quickly looked away. I can't say, he murmured, his eyes pleading with her. I don't want to drag you into this. I never wanted you to find out. Jane stood motionless, her mind working furiously. She had to get more answers, but Jacob was too scared, too caught up in whatever this was, to give her the full story. And then there was Kevin. His sudden anger and unwillingness to speak were starting to make more sense. She had to confront him. She turned to Mary, who had been silently observing the exchange, her face pale. Mary, do you know anything about this? Please, if you know something, tell me. I need to understand what's going on. Mary, who had been sitting in the corner of the room, her knees drawn up to her chest, looked up slowly. She looked defeated, like someone who had given up long ago. Her eyes met Jane's, and for the first time in a while, they weren't filled with fear or anger. They were filled with sadness. I didn't want to tell you, Mary said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. But I knew this was going to happen. Kevin, he's the one who got Jacob involved. He introduced him to them. Jane's stomach twisted at the words. Kevin, the boy she had once trusted more than anyone. The boy who had always kept his distance, the one who had seemed like the most rebellious of them all. It was hard to believe, but Mary's words rang true. Kevin? Jane asked, her voice trembling. What are you talking about? What did he get Jacob into? Mary shook her head. It's not just Kevin, Jane. They're all involved now. I don't know how deep it goes, but it's bad. They're using Jacob. They've been using him for a while, and they threatened him. They said if he didn't do what they wanted, they would hurt you. The words hit Jane like a physical blow. She had tried so hard to protect them, to give them a better life, and now this darkness was closing in on them. But who were these people? What did they want from her children, from her family? Jane stood in silence, her mind spinning. She had to take control of the situation. She couldn't let her children sink deeper into this world. But the more she learned, the more hopeless it seemed. Was it already too late to save them? Then the front door creaked open, and Jane turned sharply. Kevin stood in the doorway, his face grim, his posture stiff. It was as though he had been standing there, listening to everything. I told you to stay out of it, Jane, Kevin said, his voice low and dangerous. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Kevin, Jane said, stepping toward him, her voice calm but firm. Tell me what's going on, please. I need to know everything. I'm not going to stand by while my children are involved in something like this. Kevin's eyes flashed with anger, but there was something else there too, something darker, more secretive. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him, and his eyes flicked briefly to Jacob, who was still standing with Jane. It was clear that Kevin didn't want to face the consequences of his actions, but now he had no choice. "You don't understand," Kevin muttered. "This isn't something you can fix. These people, they don't care about anything. They'll do whatever it takes to get what they want." "Who are they?" Jane pressed, her voice rising with urgency. "Who are you all mixed up with, Kevin?" Kevin ran a hand through his hair, clearly agitated. He looked at the floor, then back at Jane. "I didn't want this, but they've got their claws in us. It's not just me anymore. They've got Jacob, they've got you in their sights, and there's nothing I can do to stop them." Jane's heart raced. "Stop who? What do they want from us? What do they want from Jacob?" Kevin took a deep breath, then his eyes locked onto hers. "Money. They're involved in some kind of illegal operation, and they need people like us to move their stuff. Jacob didn't have a choice. He was already in debt, and they threatened him. They said if he didn't do what they told him to do, they'd come after you. And that's when he started doing things for them. He didn't want to, but he didn't have a choice. I didn't know what was happening until it was too late." Jane's breath caught in her throat. Her son had been forced into this life, trapped by fear and threats, and now everything was spiraling out of control. The robbery at the store, the lies, the fear. It was all starting to make sense now. The money, the secrecy, it was all connected. "I'm sorry, Mom," Kevin whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." Jane's mind raced. She had to act, but what could she do? These people were dangerous. She couldn't just go to the police. They had already made it clear that they would hurt her family if she did. She had to find another way. "I'll fix this," Jane said, more to herself than to Kevin. "I'll do whatever it takes to get you out of this. I won't let them destroy our family." Kevin shook his head. "You don't understand. You're already in danger. We all are. There's no easy way out of this." But Jane wasn't ready to give up. She couldn't. Her family was everything to her, and she would fight to the end to keep them safe. Jane barely slept that night. The weight of what Kevin had revealed pressed heavily on her chest, suffocating her every thought. Her mind kept returning to the same question. How could this happen to her family? How could the children she had loved and raised fall so deeply into a world of darkness and crime? She knew she couldn't allow this to continue. She couldn't stand by and watch her children destroy themselves, no matter the cost. But now that the truth was out, the situation seemed far more complicated than she had imagined. Whoever these people were, they were ruthless. They had control over her children, over Jacob, whom she had trusted the most. And if she made the wrong move, they would turn their attention to her too. The next morning, Jane sat at the kitchen table, her hands shaking as she stared at the small pile of papers in front of her. The bills, the invoices, the order forms from her shop. They all seemed so insignificant now. The reality of the situation had become too overwhelming. She had to act, but how? "Mom," came a soft voice from the doorway. Jane looked up and saw Jacob standing there, his face pale, his posture stiff and hesitant. For the first time in a long time, he didn't look like the boy who had withdrawn into his own world. He seemed different, broken, as if the weight of his own secrets had crushed him completely. "Jacob," Jane said, her voice softer than she intended. She couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for him. He was just a child, after all, caught up in a mess far bigger than he was prepared for. But at the same time, the fear in his eyes told her everything. Jacob started, then stopped, swallowing hard. "I don't know what to do. I never wanted this to happen. I didn't want to get involved with them, but they said they'd hurt you. I didn't have a choice." Jane stood up, taking a deep breath as she stepped toward him. "Jacob, you didn't have to do this. You could have come to me. We could have figured something out. You don't have to let these people control you. I'm not going to let them hurt you." Jacob looked down at the floor, his hands shaking. "I thought I could handle it. I thought I could get out, but they—" He broke off and his voice trembled. "They have pictures, Mom. Pictures of you. They've been watching us. They know everything." Jane's stomach turned at the thought. Her children, her family, had been under surveillance this entire time, and she hadn't known. The fear in Jacob's eyes was enough to shatter her resolve, but at the same time it gave her something else, a sense of clarity. She had to take control of this situation. No more secrets, no more waiting. "Listen to me, Jacob," Jane said, her voice firm. You're not alone in this. We're going to figure it out together, I promise. But you have to trust me. You have to tell me everything you know. Who are these people? Where are they? I don't know everything, Jacob said, his voice barely audible. But I know they're everywhere. They've got their fingers in so many things. They've got people working for them all over the city. I don't know how they do it, but they always find a way to get what they want. Jane's mind raced. This was far bigger than anything she had anticipated. This wasn't some petty theft or robbery. This was organized crime, a network of people who were willing to do anything to get what they wanted. But how do they control you? Jane asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Why couldn't you just say no? Jacob's eyes filled with tears as he looked up at her. Because they know my weaknesses. They know my fears. They made me believe that if I didn't do what they said, they would hurt you, or Kevin, or Mary. They threatened to destroy everything we have. Jane took a step back, her mind reeling. She had raised her children with love and care, trying to shield them from the harshness of the world. But now, her greatest fear had become a reality. Someone had found a way to manipulate her children, to use their fears against them. And Kevin? Jane asked, her voice shaking. What about him? How did he get involved? I don't know all the details, Jacob replied, his voice still shaky. But I think it started when he got into trouble a while ago. He needed money, and they offered him a way out. But it wasn't a free ride. They always make you owe them. And once you owe them, there's no way out. Jane's heart broke at the thought of her son, once full of potential, now trapped in this dark world. She had always known that Kevin had a rebellious streak, but she never imagined it would lead him here. What do we do now? Jane asked, more to herself than to Jacob. How do we get out of this? Jacob didn't answer immediately. He seemed lost, unsure. Finally, he looked up at her with a deep sadness in his eyes. I don't think we can just walk away from them, Mom, he said softly. They're too powerful, too dangerous. If we try to leave, they'll come after us. They won't stop until they get what they want. Jane's chest tightened as she absorbed his words. She couldn't bear the thought of losing her children, of watching them be consumed by this world of crime. But Jacob was right. There was no easy way out. But that didn't mean there was no way at all. Jane had come too far, fought too hard, to let her children fall into this abyss. There had to be a way to fight back. She just had to find it. I won't give up on you, Jane said, her voice strong now. We're going to find a way to get you out of this, and we'll do it together. You're not alone, Jacob. I'm your mother, and I will protect you. I will do whatever it takes. Jacob stared at her, his face a mixture of disbelief and relief. For the first time in a long time, Jane saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. But the reality of the situation still loomed large. There was no going back now. The battle was just beginning. That night, Jane sat alone at the kitchen table, her mind working through the next steps. She couldn't turn to the police. They were too corrupt, too connected to the criminal underworld. She couldn't go to anyone for help. This had to be handled in secret, far from the watchful eyes of those who would hurt her family. She had no choice but to take matters into her own hands. The stakes had never been higher, and Jane was willing to do whatever it took to save her children, even if it meant facing the very people who had torn their lives apart. Jane sat alone at the kitchen table that night, her mind racing. She had just received the most chilling news imaginable, and now she had to make a decision, one that would shape the rest of her life. She couldn't just let things continue as they were. Her family was being torn apart by forces she barely understood, and she was running out of time to fix it. She was too deep in to back out now. Jacob's confession still echoed in her mind. They'll hurt you, Mom. And those words carried weight far beyond the physical threats. This wasn't just about protecting her family anymore. This was about surviving a world she never knew existed. The world her children had been sucked into without her knowledge. She had to be strong. For Jacob. For Kevin. For all of them. They had been through too much together for her to give up now. But the fear clawed at her, the thought of what might happen if she failed. As she sat there, trying to piece together a plan, she realized that she couldn't do this alone. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. She needed to make contact with someone who had the resources, the knowledge, and the skills to fight back against the people who had ensnared her family. But who? Who could she trust? And how far would she have to go to ensure that her children, and herself, were safe? She thought about the past few days, how she had watched her children spiral further into the grip of this criminal world. Kevin's behavior had become more erratic, more dangerous. He had become something she didn't recognize, someone who was willing to do anything, hurt anyone, to survive in the web that had ensnared him. And Jacob, her sweet, quiet boy, was now a pawn in this larger game, with no way out. Mary was another concern. She hadn't said much in the last few days, and Jane could tell that her daughter was struggling. There was something in Mary's eyes, a fear, a resignation, that made Jane worry she was on the verge of breaking too. Her family was fractured, each of them carrying their own burdens, their own guilt, and Jane wasn't sure how much longer they could hold on. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this situation was beyond anything she could fix on her own. She needed help, and not just anyone. She needed someone who understood how to navigate the dangerous world her children were now caught in. The criminal network that had threatened her family had far-reaching connections, and Jane had no idea who was involved or how deep it went. But there was one person she could think of who might know where to start. A man named Ray. Ray was an old acquaintance, someone Jane had known before her life had taken its quiet turn. He had worked for the police department years ago, but after some unsavory incidents, he had been dismissed. Since then, he had operated in the shadows, helping people like Jane, people who needed to clean up the messes they found themselves in. He had contacts, resources, and a reputation for getting things done. But of course, dealing with someone like Ray came with its own set of risks. He wasn't the type of person you went to for answers without paying a price, either with money or favors. Jane had no choice. If she wanted to protect her children and herself, she had to take that risk. She picked up the phone and dialed the number she hadn't called in years. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Ray." "It's Jane," she said, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. There was a long pause. "Jane, it's been a while. What do you need?" "I'm in trouble," she said, taking a deep breath. "My family's in danger. I need your help." Ray's tone shifted immediately. "What kind of trouble?" Jane hesitated. "The kind that involves people who aren't afraid to hurt you. They've got my kids involved, and I don't know how to get them out. I need you to help me figure out who they are and how to get them off our backs." Ray was silent for a moment. Then he spoke again, his voice softer now. "You don't call me unless it's serious, and I don't like hearing this. But you've made the right call. I can help, but it's gonna cost you. I don't do favors for free, Jane. You know that." "I understand," Jane replied, her voice tight with determination. "Just tell me what you need." "First, I need to meet with you," Ray said. "Come alone. I'll send you the location." Jane felt a mixture of relief and dread. She was taking a huge risk, but there was no other choice. She couldn't sit idly by while her family was being destroyed. She had to do something. "Where and when?" she asked, her voice firm. Ray gave her an address. "Be there in an hour." Jane hung up the phone, her heart racing. She didn't know what to expect from Ray, but she knew that if anyone could help them, it was him. An hour later, Jane found herself driving through unfamiliar streets, her mind focused on the task at hand. The address Ray had given her led her to a small, run-down building on the outskirts of the city, a warehouse that had long since been abandoned. The area was desolate, the kind of place where no one would think to look. She parked her car a few blocks away, her eyes scanning the surroundings. It was eerily quiet. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. She couldn't afford to be afraid now. For her children's sake, she had to push through the fear. When she reached the building, she knocked once, then stepped back, waiting. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and Ray's familiar face appeared in the dim light. "Jane," he said, his voice low. "Come in." She followed him inside, the heavy door slamming shut behind her. The warehouse was dark, with only a few scattered light bulbs overhead. Ray led her through the building, past rows of crates, until they reached a small, windowless office. "Sit down," Ray said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Let's talk." As Jane took a seat, she felt a wave of anxiety wash over her, but there was no turning back now. She had made her decision, and she was prepared to face whatever came next. "Tell me everything," Ray said, his eyes focused on her. "From the beginning." Jane took a deep breath and started speaking, recounting everything she had learned about her children's involvement with the criminals. She explained Kevin's rebellion, Jacob's manipulation, and the threats they had received. She described the fear that had taken over her family's life, and the desperate need to put a stop to it. Ray listened intently, his face unreadable. When she finished, there was a long silence. I'll get to work, he said finally. But it's not going to be easy. These people are connected, and they don't take kindly to anyone messing with their operation. But you've done the right thing by coming to me. Jane nodded, her heart still heavy with fear, but she felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. Ray was right. This wasn't going to be easy. But with his help, she believed there was a way out of the nightmare her family was trapped in.